In the frozen silence of the Canadian Arctic, a fire still smoldered beneath a pot of caribou stew, but the hands that had built it were nowhere to be found. Joe Labelle, a seasoned fur trapper toughened by years of isolation, stepped into the Inuit village at Lake Anjikuni and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero winds of the Kavalik region. It was November 1930. The world was gripped by the Great Depression, but in the northern reaches of the Northwest Territories, survival was dictated not by the stock market, but by the migration of animals and the endurance of the human spirit. Labelle knew this village well. It was a reliable sanctuary, a place of warmth, storytelling, and trade where at least 30 inhabitants lived in a close-knit community of tents and stone huts. But as he crested the final ridge and looked down at the settlement, the usual sounds of barking sled dogs and children's laughter were replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Labelle shouted a greeting, his voice echoing off the rocky shores of the lake, but there was no response. He approached the first dwelling, a skin-covered lodge, and called out again. Silence. Pushing back the flap, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A half-sewn caribou skin lay on the floor, and ivory needles still threaded through the leather as if the seamstress had merely stepped out for a moment and would return within seconds. Yet, the air inside was deathly cold. He moved to the next hut, and the next. In every single one, the story was the same. Personal belongings, precious rifles, and winter clothing items no Arctic hunter would ever leave behind sat undisturbed. In one lodge, a pot of food had burned to a black crust over a fire that had long since died out. The disappearance at Lake Anjikuni was not just a case of a missing group of people, it was an erasure. An entire community had seemingly blinked out of existence in the middle of their daily chores. This was the beginning of one of the most unsettling mysteries in the annals of the North, a dark history that challenges our understanding of logic and leaves a permanent stain on the map of the Barren Lands. To understand the magnitude of what Labelle discovered, one must understand the environment. The Kavalik region is a vast, unforgiving expanse of tundra. In 1930, it was one of the most isolated places on Earth. The people who lived there were masters of survival. They didn't just vanish by mistake. They were intimately familiar with the weather, the predators, and the terrain. If a village decided to move, it was a calculated, laborious process. They would take their kayaks, their sleds, their dogs, and every scrap of metal or leather they owned. They would never leave their primary means of survival behind. Labelle, shivering with a growing sense of dread, began to search the perimeter of the village. He looked for tracks in the fresh snow, expecting to see the chaotic prints of a mass exodus or the signs of a struggle. But the snow around the village was pristine, save for his own tracks and the old, wind-worn marks of the villagers from days prior. There were no signs of a raid by a rival group, no bloodstains, and no evidence of a sudden animal attack. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed every man, woman, and child. As he reached the edge of the clearing, Labelle made two discoveries that elevated the situation from a mystery to a nightmare. First, he found the sled dogs. These animals were the lifeblood of the Arctic, treated with the utmost care because a hunter's life depended on them. Labelle found 7 of them tied to some stunted trees near the village. They had not been killed by a predator or a person. They had starved to death while still tethered to their posts, their bodies frozen into stiff, furry statues. For an Inuit hunter to allow his dogs to starve to death while he was nearby was unthinkable. It was a sin against survival. The second discovery was even more profane. Labelle walked toward the village's small burial ground, a place where the ancestors were laid to rest beneath heavy cairns of rock to protect them from scavengers. He found that one of the graves had been disturbed. The heavy stones had been tossed aside with a strength that seemed beyond human, and the body inside had been removed. This wasn't the work of a hungry polar bear. The rocks were piled in neat stacks on either side of the empty trench. In the spiritual tradition of the local tribes, the desecration of a grave was a terrifying omen, a sign of a curse or an evil spirit. Terrified and exhausted, Labelle fled the village. He trekked for miles through the biting cold until he reached a telegraph office at a distant outpost. With trembling hands, he sent a message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP. He reported that a village of at least 30 people had vanished, and that something deeply wrong had taken place at Lake Anjikuni. When the RCMP arrived several days later, led by Sergeant J. Nelson, the mystery only deepened. They confirmed Labelle's account of the abandoned huts and the dead dogs. During their investigation, they supposedly interviewed a trapper named Armand Laurent and his two sons who lived in the region. The Laurents claimed that they had seen a strange, glowing object in the sky a few nights prior to Labelle's discovery. They described a light that changed shape, moving toward the direction of the lake where the village sat. This detail would later become a cornerstone for those who believed the disappearance was not of this world, though the RCMP's official reports remained focused on more grounded explanations. The police conducted a massive search of the surrounding tundra, but their efforts were hampered by the onset of winter storms. They found nothing. No bodies, no discarded equipment, and no trail. It was as if 30 people had walked into the air. The RCMP files from the era are famously sparse on the event, which has led many to believe that the scale of the tragedy was either suppressed or that the officers were simply unable to comprehend what they were looking at. In the months following the incident, the story began to leak into the press. On November 27, 1930, the Lupa Gazette in Manitoba published an account of the event, and shortly after, the Danville Bee picked up the story, introducing the Village of the Dead to a wider audience. The numbers began to fluctuate in these reports. Some claimed 30 people were gone, while later sensationalized versions of the story, penned by journalists like Emmett Kelleher, claimed the number was as high as 2,000. Kelleher was known for his colorful writing, and skeptics argue he may have exaggerated the details to create a more gripping narrative. Yet, even if we accept the lower number of 30 people, the mystery remains just as profound. How does a group of 30 expert survivors vanish without a trace in a landscape where every footstep is recorded in the snow? As the decades passed, the disappearance at Lake Anjikuni became a staple of high strangeness lore. In the 1950s, Frank Edwards, a prominent author on the paranormal, included the story in his book Stranger Than Science, cementing the narrative of the frozen stew and the needle in the leather. It was Edwards who leaned heavily into the UFO theory, suggesting that the glowing lights seen by the Laurent family were the key to the mystery. He argued that the village had been the site of a mass abduction, a theory that gained traction during the Cold War era's obsession with extraterrestrial visitors. However, the dark history of Anjikuni also offers more grounded, though no less unsettling, possibilities. Some historians and anthropologists suggest that the village may have fallen victim to a sudden, localized epidemic. Smallpox, influenza, or even a severe case of food poisoning from tainted meat could have decimated a small population quickly. But this theory fails to explain the lack of bodies. If they had died of disease, the RCMP would have found a village full of corpses, not an empty settlement with food still on the stove. Others point toward the psychological phenomenon known as Arctic hysteria or Pibloktok. This is a condition observed in some Arctic communities where individuals experience sudden, irrational outbursts, often running out into the snow or performing dangerous acts. While this has been documented in individuals, the idea of an entire village simultaneously succumbing to a mass delusion and walking into the frozen waste to die is unprecedented. And again, it leaves the question, where were the bodies? The search parties were thorough, and in the treeless tundra, a group of 30 people cannot easily hide. Then, there is the indigenous perspective, often overlooked in the sensationalized Western retellings. To the local Inuit, the barren lands are not empty, they are populated by spirits, some benevolent and some malevolent. Stories of the Tornit, a race of giants, or the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit that haunts the hungry, are woven into the fabric of the North. To those who lived in the shadow of the mountains, the desecration of the grave was the most telling clue. It suggested that something had come for the village, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Some believe the villagers saw a sign of a coming evil and fled in such a panic that they forgot their dogs and their tools, eventually perishing in the deep snow where the drifts would hide their remains for eternity. In the 1930s and again in the 1950s, the RCMP attempted to downplay the story. They issued statements claiming that Joe Labelle was a newcomer to the area and might have exaggerated the size of the village, or that the settlement was merely a temporary camp that had been moved. But Labelle was no amateur. He was a trapper who knew the region's geography and its people. His description of the burned stew and the half-sewn skins implies a sudden, interrupted moment, not a planned relocation. Furthermore, the RCMP's own records of the dead dogs and the disturbed grave remain difficult to hand-wave away as mere exaggeration. One of the most chilling details often cited by researchers is the timing of the disappearance. It occurred at the onset of a particularly brutal winter, a time when the veil between survival and death is thinnest. If the villagers were forced out of their homes by some unseen threat, they were walking into a certain death. The fact that they chose the freezing tundra over staying in their huts suggests that whatever they saw, or whatever they thought was coming, was more terrifying than the prospect of freezing to death in the dark. The case of Lake Anjikuni remains an open wound in the history of the North. It sits at the intersection of folklore, paranormal theory, and cold, hard reality. To this day, hikers and researchers who visit the shores of the lake report an overwhelming sense of being watched. The stone huts are gone now, reclaimed by the shifting earth and the relentless wind, but the atmosphere of the place remains heavy. Was it a hoax created by a lonely trapper and a sensationalist journalist? If so, why did the RCMP feel the need to investigate and file reports that partially corroborated the bizarre scene? Was it a mass abduction, a phenomenon that defies our laws of physics? Or was it something more ancient, a dark chapter of human history where a group of people simply lost their battle against the supernatural or psychological pressures of the absolute cold? The mystery of Lake Anjikuni isn't just about the 30 people who vanished. It's about the silence they left behind. It's a reminder that even in our modern, mapped-out world, there are pockets of the earth where the shadows are deeper than they should be. The fire at the village may have gone out nearly a century ago, but the questions it raised continue to smolder. We may never know what Joe Labelle truly saw that November night, or what became of the mothers, fathers, and children who once called the shores of Anjikuni home. They are gone, leaving only the memory of a needle in a skin and the hollow wind whistling through an empty grave. The North keeps its secrets buried deep beneath the ice, and some secrets are perhaps better left undisturbed. If you venture into the barren lands, listen closely to the wind over the water. It's said that if you stay long enough, you can still hear the echo of a village that isn't there, a haunting reminder that in the dark corners of history, people don't just die sometimes, they simply cease to be. The Arctic is a place of beauty, but it is also a place of profound, ancient terror. The disappearance at Lake Anjikuni serves as a grim monument to that truth. As we look back through the fog of time, we are left to wonder if the villagers are still out there in some form, wandering the permafrost, or if they were taken by something that still waits in the whiteout for the next traveler to lose their way. The case remains unsolved, a ghost story written in the snow, a mystery that continues to haunt the edges of our reality. What do you believe happened to the people of the lake? Was it a tragedy of the natural world, or did they encounter something that we are not yet meant to understand? The answer lies somewhere in the frozen heart of the Kavalik, guarded by the spirits of the dead and the eternal silence of the north. For those who seek the truth behind the world's most unsettling disappearances, the story of Lake Anjikuni is a warning. History is not always a straight line of progress. Sometimes, it is a series of vanishing points. Explore the dark corners of the past with us, and remember, not every person who disappears wants to be found, and some places are better left to the shadows. Subscribe to join us as we uncover more chapters of the history the world tried to forget.